EXPBIO-NSR-Project. I'm Karin Amsten from the Vlaamse Landmaatschappij, the Flemish Land Agency, and I work in the Department of Agro-Environmental Schemes. EXPBIO is a collaboration of 8 partners across Sweden, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. We are municipalities, universities, botanical gardens, public research institutes, and governmental agencies. And EXPBIO is funded by the EU Interreg Nordic program. Our shared goal is to reverse the decline of grassland biodiversity and bring back flower-rich habitats in the North Sea region. By combining knowledge and experience from different countries, we are exploring practical management practices and creating tools to help local plant communities flourish. This spring, we held a series of webinars on seed mixtures and seed cultivation. Today, we continue this journey with 6 inspiring speakers sharing their latest insights on restoring and rediversifying grasslands across Northwest Europe. Last week, we listened to the webinar of Anne Schrijver, focusing on actionable tools for nature and green space managers. She taught us how to create flower-rich grasslands on nutrient-rich soils and that the forage quality is fine for cattle. This week, Karin Amsten is here to talk about fire and herbivory. Karin Amsten is a research coordinator at the Foundation Nordens Ark. She coordinates Nordens Ark own research, such as natural processes in open landscapes and the origin and ecology of the northern brown bee, as well as coordinating national and international research collaborations. Her own research focuses on the effect of herbivores and fire in temperate open habitats. This webinar is focusing on the roles of large herbivore grazing and fire in shaping open ecosystems. In Sweden, burning is a common management practice, but in other European countries, this is not the case or is even prohibited. The aim of European projects is to look beyond borders and learn from each other's approaches. I'm curious about your lecture, Karin, and to hear more about the advantages and disadvantages of this method. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour, with 30 to 40 minutes for the presentation and the rest of the time for questions. So some technical issues. Gunilla Hell-Bellman is in charge of the technical aspects. You see her on the screen. She will ensure that everything runs smoothly. We ask you to mute your microphone and to use the chat for communication and the questions. So with that, I give the floor to you, Karin.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting webinar series. And as Katrin said, I'm Karin Amsten, and I work as a research coordinator at Foundation Nordens Ark in Bohuslän, Sweden. And I will share some of our research on important processes and drivers of temperate open ecosystems. So for those of you that have not heard about Nordens Ark, we are a non-profit organization that works with biodiversity conservation. And one important task is, of course, to spread information and knowledge, which we do in our zoological park. But most of our work takes place outside the public area. We work with breeding and reintroduction of both large, well-known species, but also smaller, less-known species, such as beetles and butterflies. But we also work in the field with inventories, nature restoration, and with increasing knowledge and engagement, both nationally and internationally. And we also conduct research within many different projects. And one of our largest projects is the Eco Park, where we, among other things, conduct studies on open ecosystems. But why do we talk about open ecosystems? Well, as we all know, open ecosystems are some of the most diverse ecosystems of the world. And there are many different kinds of organisms that are associated with or even dependent on open habitats. For example, many animals and plants. But open habitats are also some of the most threatened ecosystems of the world. And there are, of course, different types of open habitats with different drivers. And some are driven by abiotic factors such as temperature and humidity, like deserts or wetlands or tundra. And in these habitats, the conditions prevents wood vegetation from growing into forests. and they are simply too dry, too wet, or too cold. But there are also open habitats that are driven by biotic factors, such as large herbivores, for example. And African savannas and grasslands are examples of these kinds of habitats. And in these habitats, the conditions are actually quite good for shrubs and trees, as you can see. But herbivores limit the woody vegetation. And you can also say that they control the vegetation. But it's not only the herbivores that control the woody vegetation in these types of habitats. Like herbivory, fire is also a consumer of biomass. So this process is therefore referred to as consumer control. And in a habitat controlled by consumers, the vegetation is kept within a browse or fire trap, which is basically the height to which the herbivores or the flames can reach. And this allows grasses and other ground vegetation, such as herbs and forbs, to coexist with trees and shrubs. And the only chance for the woody vegetation to escape is either a release in herbivory and or fire, or to evolve adaptations to these processes. So this concept of consumer control is a well-established concept in both Africa and in America. So this is the Masai Mara National Park in Kenya. And African savannas are considered as natural habitat, of course, and driven by large wild herbivores and recurring fires. This is another example of a natural consumer-controlled habitat, which is the Kruger National Park in South Africa. Here you can see a bit more trees, but still it's an open ecosystem with a ground layer of grasses and herbs. Then what about this ecosystem? This is the Mols Laboratory in Denmark, in the northern part of Europe. Is this considered an ecosystem that is natural? And which are the drivers in these types of ecosystems? Well, in Europe, we often talk about primary and secondary grasslands. And there are some differences in the definition of these concepts. But in general, primary grasslands have never, or for a very long time, not been affected by human activity, and they are driven by natural processes. Secondary grasslands, on the other hand, have derived from human activity and also depend on human interventions. However, in Europe, we have almost no primary grasslands left because the natural processes that drives them, which is large herbivores and recurring fires, they have been absent for a very long time. So therefore, almost all open habitats in Europe, and especially in Sweden, are defined or considered as secondary grasslands and seen as cultural remnants of human activities, which of course some of them are, but not all of them. But we must not forget that there have been primary grasslands also in Europe, driven by large wild herbivores and also natural fires. Because there are many fossils of large grazers found also in the northern part of Europe. For example, in Sweden, there were European bison until 9,000 years ago, and we had aurochs in Sweden until about 4,000 years ago. This figure comes from a study published 2 years ago, and it shows all, or at least some of the large mammals that were present in the last interglacial, which was about 100,000 years ago. And as you can see, there were quite a few species of large herbivores. There were wild horses, there were aurochs, giant deer, and different kinds of rhinos, and also elephants. And then came the Ice Age, which with the ice totally covering the northern parts of Europe. But then when the ice finally retracted north about 12,000 years ago, the animals and also the plants started to recolonize the northern parts of Europe. But it was not only the animals and plants that returned to the northern parts. During the end of the Ice Age, the first modern humans also colonized the southern parts of Europe about 40,000 years ago. And they also followed the ice north. And since then, we humans have modified nature. And now, this is what remains of the fauna of large mammals. And as you can see, all the large animals are gone. And there is only one herbivore weighing more than 300 kilos, which is the moose. For sure, we have some bison present, but they have just been introduced and the range is still quite small. So we don't have any large or mega herbivores anymore in Europe. And this figure shows the species richness and total biomass of large mammals before and after the Ice Age. So to the left, you see species richness, and at the top you have the number of species during the last interglacial before the Ice Age. And the brighter green, the more species, and the darker blue, the fewer species. And in the bottom, to the left, you have the present number of species. So we have lost more than 70% of all the large mammals species in Europe. But even more interesting and more important are the figure to the right, where we see the total biomass of large mammals. In the last interglacial, the biomass was on average 19 tons per square kilometer. And today we have on average 0.6 tons per square kilometers. And we have almost lost 95% of the total biomass of large mammals. But what does this really mean for the ecosystem? Well, the larger part of the species lost were herbivores. And what do herbivores do? Well, they consume biomass. So this figure shows how much of the vegetation consumption we have lost. And the darker green, the more we have lost. And as you can see, it's quite dark green, this map. We have lost 82% of the consumption of vegetation. But then you might ask, what about the domestic herbivores? Doesn't they count? Well, absolutely. When humans came and started to make an impact on nature, the large herbivores disappeared one by one. But soon, their function in the ecosystem was to some extent replaced by our livestock. So open ecosystems were maintained and in some places recreated by herbivory by domestic herbivores. But then, to increase efficiency, the livestock were moved into stables and barns. And they are no longer a part of the ecosystem. Instead, they receive fodder that has been growing on fertilized, highly productive fields. So first we replaced the wild herbivores with our livestock, but then we also removed them from the ecosystem and thereby remove an important natural processes, which is herbivory. And the other missing process is fire. With the help of dendrochronology, we know that fire have been a recurring event also in Europe, although they were probably not as frequent as in Africa. And similarly to herbivory, natural fires were replaced by prescribed fires, for example, to improve the pasture for the livestock. But this method is also abandoned, and fire is no longer seen as a natural process in Europe. And finally, to consolidate that open ecosystem is a natural habitat also in temperate Europe, we have a large number of native open habitat species. For example, the oak have been present in Sweden since the early Holocene, and they need open habitats to grow. So coming back to this picture, yes, this is a natural habitat also in Northern Europe. However, today we miss two important drivers, which are large herbivores and fires, either in a natural or in a domestic shape, so to speak. So that is the background to our study on the effect of both fire and herbivory in a temperate ecosystem. This study was carried out in the Nordens Ark Ecopark, and in the Ecopark we established 24 permanent study plots in 2015, and each plot was divided into 4 subplots, which of 2 were fenced to prevent herbivory, and 2 were chosen for prescribed fire. And this gave us 4 different treatment combinations: only fire, only herbivory, both fire and herbivory, and also a control with neither fire nor herbivory. And since 2015, the pastures where the plots are located have been grazed every season from May till October, mainly by old native breeds, which we also work with, of cattle. And we have also conducted prescribed fires every spring in the subplots that were chosen for burning. And in 2017, we also duplicated all the plots to enlarge the study. And since I know that some of you are not familiar with fire as a tool for nature conservation, I first wanted to introduce the method for you. So it's becoming more and more common to use fire in nature conservation in Sweden. It's very common in heathlands, but also in grasslands. And the purpose is to remove old biomass that otherwise would prevent new, less competitive vegetation from establishing, and also to rejuvenate the vegetation. And mostly the fires have very low intensity, and there is, of course, very high security when conducting prescribed fires. And here you can see some pictures from our burnings. And as I said, it takes place in spring when there is only dead material. The reason why we do it in spring is that we want to mimic the prescribed fires that were done to promote fodder for the animals. And also, if we would burn in summer, the only time when it's possible to burn in summer is after a very, very long drought. And first of all, it's quite dangerous to burn in these periods. And also, it's not always possible to burn. And it's not always allowed to burn in this season. So that's why we are burning in spring. And of course, we burn every spring, and that's probably not a natural fire regime, but we want to have quick results, so to speak. So we do it every spring just to have the result a bit quicker. What the normal fire regime is in this part of the world, that is not set yet. We know that for example, in Africa, a normal fire regime would be every 3rd year. Probably up here it would be less frequent because we don't have the same productivity and don't produce the same amount of fuel for fires. So we don't know what the natural fire regime would be in temperate grasslands yet. And of course, we are always many people supervising the fire, and we use special equipment. So like you can see in the upper left picture, I have a drip torch tool for the ignition. And I draw these parallel lines for the ignition. And we also use special fire whips to put out the fire if it spreads. And we, of course, always have a large amount of water close by. And we only burn when it's not too windy, but we still always burn against the wind to reduce the rate of spread of the fire. And we also always burn small portion at a time to have full control of the fire. So we start in the exit point of the wind of the area and do a small line of burning, and then we continue behind that line. So we always have a burn line as a safety zone. And just to give you an idea of the intensity, here is a short video, the burning. And as you can see, it has a very low intensity. This is just, the flames are just a few centimeters or maybe some 20 centimeters or so. So very low intensity of the fires and very controlled. So to measure the effect of fire herbivory on the vegetation, we planted tree saplings on different native tree species. And the species were chosen to include species with adaptations to either fire or herbivory, but also species without these adaptations. And the saplings were about 1 to 2 years old and ranged from 30 to 100 centimeters in size. And in each subplot, we planted 5 saplings of each species. So in total, we had 480 individuals of each species in the study. And we also studied the effect of 5 zone open habitat forbs. And the species were chosen to represent different levels of sensitivity to the absence of herbivory. And they were planted at 2 occasions, 2016 and 2017. And we used grids, as you can see on the picture, for the sowing. So each species had a separate grid. And in 2022, small cages were set up around the sowing grids in half of the graze plots to protect half of them from grazing. And finally, we also looked at the naturally regenerated vegetation in the plots. So we estimate both the woody and herbaceous biomass with different methods. And the results from the experiment show a great difference between the different treatments and also between the different species of vegetation. So first we have the difference in the planted tree saplings, and here we see 2 planted pines, and the one to the left is planted inside the fence, which is 2.5 meters. The seedling is 2.5 meters. And on the right, you see the same aged pine sapling on the outside of the fence. And as you can see, the one to the right is highly affected by herbivory. So we found that the survival was affected by both fire and herbivory, but we also found that the effect differed between different species. So all species had a lower survival in the presence of herbivores, which are the red bars in the figure. And the beige bar is the control. So you can see that the red bars are much lower. And all species also had a lower survival in fire, which are the orange bar, except from oak, which was not affected at all in comparison with the control. So these results confirm that different species have different adaptations to different consumers. And here we see the result of the sowing of flowers. In the top figure, we looked at the establishment, which was defined as the development of a rosette with mature leaves. And the highest number of rosettes was found in the 2 graze treatments. We had some rosettes in the fire treatment, and as you can see, there were almost no establishment rosettes in the control treatment with neither fire nor herbivory. And then we looked at the production of inflorescence or flower stalks, which is presented in the figure in the middle. And the highest number of flower stalk was found in the fire-only treatment, the orange bar. And in the 2 graze treatments, we had some flower stalks, but in the control, we had no flower stalks at all. And finally, after caging in 2022, we looked at the remaining number of flowers in the end of the grazing season. And not surprisingly, maybe, we found that 89% of the flowers remained inside the cages compared to only 66% on the outside. So basically, what these figures show is that forbs need some kind of consumer to remove the competition from grasses to establish, preferably herbivores. But when it's time to reproduce, to put up flower stalks, they need a relief in grazing pressure. Otherwise, all of the flower stalks will be eaten, or at least many of the flower stalk will be eaten. So finally, here are the results of the biomass comparison. On the top, you can see the difference in tree biomass between the treatments, which is different colors, and between the 2 establishment years. So if you remember, I said that the first plots were established in 2015, and then we duplicated them in 2017. So there is a delay in the development of the 2017 plots. And both establishment years had the highest biomass in the control. So the highest biomass of woody vegetation was found in the control. And the lowest was found in the 2 graze treatments, the graze and fire treatment. And below, you see the grass biomass, which also includes herbs. And here we found the highest biomass in the fire-only treatment. Sorry, it was a bit quick there. So the highest biomass of grass and herbs, which was also included here, the whole ground layer, was found in the fire-only treatment. And it was quite reduced by grazing. And in the control, which is very interesting, we can clearly see that the herbaceous vegetation is outshaded by the trees, which reflects what is happening in open ecosystems today. So we have done another study as well in this project, where we studied the interaction of fire and herbivory. And to do this, we used camera traps, which were placed to cover as much as possible of the grazed area of the plots, as you can see in the picture. And we also studied the effect of fuel load and fire intensity over 5 years in this study, which I will explain. But first, the background to this study is the concept of pyrrhic herbivory, which was first introduced by Pfullendorf et al. In 2009. And the concept is defined as herbivory driven by fire. And it's based on the fact that herbivores are attracted to newly burned areas due to the resprouting fresh vegetation. So the figure is a conceptual model of pyrrhic herbivory. The new vegetation that resprouts after a fire is high in nutrients and attracts herbivores. And they graze and remove biomass and thereby reduces the chances for new fires in the area. In other areas that are not grazed, there is instead an increase in fuel, which increases the chances for fires in that area. And when that area burns, the herbivores will move to that area instead. And after some time, there will be enough fuel in the first area for a new fire. And then the herbivores will go back to that area. So this process creates high heterogeneity in the landscape, both in time and in space. But of course, if the fire is absent and the herbivores disappear for a longer time, the area will instead turn into a forest. So that was the background, and here is the result of our study of pyrrhic herbivory. So in the top figure, we can see that in the pastures with the highest productivity, which was paddock 1, we saw that the cattle preferred to graze in the newly burned parts of the plot. So this figure shows the time they spent grazing in the different parts of the plots, the burned or the unburned, and the green bars is the burned area. So you can see in paddock 1, they choose to graze more in the newly burned area. So in the other paddocks, which had a lower productivity, they also had a lower fuel load. So the fuel load was basically too low for the fire to have an effect on the behavior of the cattle. You can see in paddock 2, 3, and 4, there is no difference between the time spent in the different parts. So further, we also saw that the increased grazing pressure in paddock 1 of the fire in the burned areas resulted in a reduced fuel load over 5 years, and thereby also a reduction in fire size, which you can see in the lower figure. So paddock 1 is the red line here, and as you can see, the fire or the area that was burned, that reflects basically the fire intensity and also the fuel load, it decreased over the years. So this means that the increased grazing by cattle in the burned subplots decreased the fuel load for the future fires, and thereby also reducing the likelihood of future fires, as I described in the previous picture on pyrrhic herbivory. So this is maybe a bit more visual. This is the same plot in paddock 1, and the picture to the left is after the first fire in 2015. And as you can see, almost all the plots is burned. And the picture to the right is the same plot, but after 5 years of treatment. And as you can see, there is much more patchy burning and also less flammable fuel in this plot. So to summarize, fire and herbivory are natural drivers of of open habitats, also in the northern parts of Europe. And temperate vegetation are adapted and sometimes even dependent on fire and herbivory. And they are therefore important tools because they can both be used to create heterogeneity on landscape level and thereby also promote biodiversity. And by that, I want to say thank you for listening. And now it's up to you to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Karin, for your interesting talk. I see there are no questions for the moment in the chat. Everyone can put the questions in the chat. I will start with one question, Karin.
Yeah.
You mentioned that conservation burning is a common practice in Sweden. Do you know why it isn't common in other countries and what the possible barriers are in other countries for doing it? And do you see a possible implementation in other countries of Europe?
Yeah, of course, I think that, as you mentioned in the introduction, that this is about legislation in some countries, because in some areas you're not allowed to use fire for nature conservation. In some countries you are, but it's not that common. And I think it has a lot to do with the community structure and what is common and what is usually used. And of course, it also has with population density. I mean, in Sweden, we're not as densely populated as, for example, in Belgium or Holland or other continental countries of Europe. So I think it's also about safety, I believe, because, I mean, fire is a quite controversial method. Fire can cause large damages and also can be dangerous if you use it wrong. And so it's a quite controversial method, actually. But it's important to distinguish between wildfires and prescribed fires. A wildfire is something that goes totally without control in the field, while prescribed fire is very controlled, they're very strict, and they are conducted in small areas and, yeah, very controlled. But with that said, I do not recommend that each and every person go out and just put out fires in their backyard or whatever, because fire is fire. Fire is dangerous, can be dangerous. However, I think that it is a possible tool in planned nature management and nature conservation, because it can be done under strict regulation and controlled manners. So I do think that it could be used also in other countries. Of course, you also have to look at other things like how it can be used and in which areas and so on. But yes, I definitely think that more countries can use it as a tool.
Thank you. I will look at the questions in the chat. First question, what is the impact of fire on grassland insects and birds? Did you take any precautions to avoid harming them?
A very good question. So of course, fire is fire, and we don't take any precautions in that instant burning, but we more look at a longer perspective. So we know that keeping the ecosystem open will, of course, promote many types of organisms, such as insects and also birds, because they depend on open habitats. And since this is not, as I showed you, this is a very low intensity fire. It's not a forest fire that can rush several hundred meters in a very short time. This is a very slow burning. So if there are any, at least larger animals, insects, birds in the area, they do have the chance to go away, definitely. So we look at it in a larger or a longer perspective.
A second question, does ash have some kind of effect on the growth of plants in grasslands?
Yes, it certainly has. We have not looked at the ash in this study, and we have not looked at the soil conditions in this study, but of course that has an effect, and that is something that we want to include in the future in this project, because it still continues. It's not that intense anymore, but we still do graze the areas and we still do burn the areas. So it's something that we have been planning to follow up, definitely.
Then another question, have you looked at growth rings of perennial herbaceous plants? This could be interesting to look into from plants that have rhizomes underground. They could possibly survive the fire, have fire scars, and get other interesting information about fire effect.
So we have in another smaller project, we have been looking at growth rings, especially on trees, and we see that the growth rate is much slower in the grazed areas, at least. We have not so much looked at the fire, but it's not only that the trees are trampled or broken or eaten on, but they are also reduced in growth, in size, in width. So they are definitely inhibited by grazing also, not just by that they are broken or eaten at the top, but they are certainly inhibited by the grazing. That was one of the questions. I'm looking in the chat as well, so I see if I yeah, so we have also looked at different strategies to survive these kinds of disturbances, herbivory and fire. So we see that the different species have different strategies, definitely. So for example, we saw in oak that they survive by resprouting. So after each fire, the main stem dies, but they can resprout and resprout and resprout. So they are simply kept within the fire trap until there is a release in fire, and then they can grow into large trees. With pine, for example, we saw that the few individuals that did survive, they invested in growing quite fast and tried to grow out of the fire trap fast. So that is different strategies to actually cope with these different kind of disturbances. Maybe that was not totally the answer on the questions, but yeah, a bit.
Yes, I think so. And if it's not, the person that asked the question can add another question in the chat. Is there a difference of what herbivores choose, like cattle or sheep?
That's also a very interesting question, because in this project we used cattle as a sort of substitute for a large herbivore. But of course, there are so many different kinds of herbivores that do eat differently. They have different ways to eat. They have different choices what to eat and so on. So of course, this is just one of the many different kinds of herbivores. And this is a large grazer. Of course, we also have large browsers. But yes, there are differences, and we would like to continue this project with also including different kinds of herbivores like sheep, but also horse, and also maybe also bison in some way. So definitely there are different ways that herbivore eat, and that's of course also shape and create the heterogeneity if there are different kinds of herbivores. And also there are differences between species, because we used native breeds in the beginning of the project. We also used some more commercial breeds. We used Hereford, for example, which is a much heavier breed than the native breeds, and they have a total different effect on the landscape than the native breeds. So of course there are many different kinds of differences to take into account.
How often can you use fire as a method on the same area without hurting it?
That's also a good question. We saw in the one of the pictures that I showed you, we saw a decrease in fuel load. So that after 5 years, the fuel load in the productive area was as low as in the unproductive areas. So basically what happens if you burn every year, there will not be any fuel for fire. So the fire will not have an effect. So the fire doesn't harm the area. But of course, as I talked about, if you want to mimic a natural fire regime, then it should not be every year. It maybe, I don't know, I can't answer how often there should be a fire in this area because it hasn't been any studies on that. But basically what happens if you burn too often, there is nothing to burn in the end because the fuel load decreases over time.
And the next question, can you say how the result would differ under a more natural fire regime, like you mentioned, fire every 3 years instead of every year?
Exactly. So what is the difference between Africa and in our area is that in Africa there is a bit more, it's a bit more hotter, that the vegetation grows a bit faster, so you have a quicker increase in fuel load in Africa. So basically, when there is a natural fire in Africa, it burns and it reduces and removes all the dead material. And then there is not enough dead material for a fire until the next coming 3 years or so, on average. In this area, it will probably take much longer time for the right amount of fuel load to increase so that there would be a natural fire. So that's why I'm saying that the natural fire regime would be much longer here than in other more productive areas of the world. Yeah.
And how long before the first fire were the shrubs planted? What would be the difference with older trees?
So what we saw in this study was quite interesting because we saw that species that were supposed to be fire tolerant, for example, birch and pine, they were actually quite affected by fire. And of course, that depends on that these saplings were quite small. For example, pine, the strategy that they have for surviving fire is that they have a very thick bark, and small saplings doesn't have that thick bark. So in that stage, they are not especially tolerant to fire. And the thing with pine is that they do establish and germinate after a fire, and then probably it won't be a fire in a few years. So they have the time to actually grow into larger trees with thicker bark before the next fire naturally would have occurred. So in this case, they were very small and they did not have all the adaptations that they and characteristics that they need to survive fire. So of course, it depends on the size of the trees. So in this study, we did a burning, we did burn the area, and then we planted the trees after that. So it was 1 year until they were burned the first time. But of course, that also have an effect.
The next question, I think you mentioned the grazing was limited to the summer half of the year. Do you have any thoughts on the model of year-round low-intensity grazing common in rewilding-inspired conservation?
Another interesting topic that we are also discussing, because of course there is a difference in having a larger group of individuals grazing during the vegetation season and then remove them during winter, than having a smaller group that graze all year around, because they will have a total different effect on the vegetation, especially during the winter. They will have a total different effect on the woody vegetation, for example. So that is a very interesting topic, and that is definitely something that we want to study more in the future. So yeah, very interesting and very important.
And the next question is a question that goes further on the question before about the growth rings. The question was about growth rings on forbs. For example, the genus Plantago, Philippondula, Centaurea. For growth rings is the focus of my research. I just thought that the info from their growth ring data connected to fire events could help out your study to get different insights.
Yeah, so this is not my, out of my knowledge. This is definitely something that we could look into, but we haven't done it so far, and it's out of my knowledge base. So yeah, but that's a good input, really.
So that were all the questions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there is another last question. No, I don't think so. Okay. Thank you very much, Karin, for your talk.
Thank you for inviting me.
It was very interesting. Next week, we will have another interesting webinar given by Sandrine Godefroy from Mesa Botanical Garden. She will give a presentation on grassland restoration through the localization of rare plant species. If you would like to attend other webinars of this webinar series, please register for every webinar you would like to attend. So you will receive the link. All the webinars will be recorded and can later be seen